There is a city in America where moose occasionally wander through the parking lots of fast food restaurants, where the food culture sits at the exact collision point between indigenous Arctic tradition, mid-century roadside Americana, and the kind of frontier improvisation that happens when you're 1,500 miles from the nearest interstate connection to the rest of the country. Anchorage. Population 290,000. Nearly half the entire state of Alaska living in one municipality. Built on a railroad construction camp in 1915, transformed by oil money and military bases, surrounded by mountains, glaciers, and some of the most productive wild salmon waters on Earth. Long before Anchorage existed as a city, the indigenous peoples of Alaska, the Yupik, Inupiat, and Athabascan, had already solved the problem of how to make a high-energy, portable food that a hunter could carry on a multi-day expedition into Arctic cold. Their answer was akutak. Akutak is a Yupik word meaning to mix together, and that's exactly the technique. Whipped animal fat, traditionally seal oil, reindeer tallow, or rendered fat from moose, caribou, or whale, combined by hand with wild berries and freshly fallen snow or water, beaten until air works its way through the mixture and it sets into something with the texture of a light, frozen mousse. No dairy, no refrigeration unit, no sugar in the oldest versions. Just fat, fruit, and cold. The dish was traditionally made by the women of a hunting family, the grandmother or mother, and the first batch of the season was often prepared after the family's first successful catch of a seal or polar bear, then shared communally during ceremonies. Akutak was made for funerals, for potlatches, for the celebration marking a boy's first successful hunt, and for nearly any other occasion that called the community together. Protein-heavy versions made with dried meat instead of berries could be cut into solid pieces and carried on long journeys as emergency rations, a frozen survival food disguised as a treat. Every family historically had its own version, shaped by what berries grew where they lived. Salmon berries, blueberries, crowberries, depending on the region. And Alaska native tradition holds that the specific berry you choose for your akutak is something close to a lifetime decision, not a casual preference. You will not find this on a hot dog cart in most of the country, and that's precisely the point. A reindeer dog is a hot dog made from reindeer meat instead of beef or pork. Leaner, slightly sweeter, with a deeper, more specific flavor than a standard frank. Usually sold from street carts that cluster downtown near the 4th Avenue tourist corridor and the cruise ship terminals. The classic Anchorage build piles the reindeer sausage with grilled onions, sauerkraut, and cream cheese, a combination that sounds improbable until you've actually eaten one, standing on a downtown street corner in July, with the midnight sun still working its way toward the horizon. The reindeer itself connects directly back to Alaska's herding economy. Domesticated reindeer were introduced to Alaska from Siberia in the 1890s, specifically to give Alaska native communities in the western part of the state a stable meat source as wild caribou populations fluctuated. The meat that ends up in a downtown Anchorage hot dog cart today descends from that same herding tradition, repackaged into the single most recognizable street food a tourist will encounter walking off a cruise ship in Anchorage. In the summer of 1955, a World War II pilot named George Brown and his wife Peggy bought 3 lots on East 5th Avenue from a Norwegian carpenter everyone called Bicycle Pete. George, working as a labor foreman, built the restaurant himself in the evenings and on weekends with a partner named Sven Jonassen, while Peggy worked shifts at the local A&W to help keep the family afloat during construction. On November 30th, 1955, the Lucky Wishbone opened its doors in downtown Anchorage, 3 years before Alaska even became a state. The featured item was a fried chicken recipe adapted from George's grandmother Dagny's Sunday dinner table. A regular hamburger cost 40 cents. The pop-size fried chicken dinner cost $1.80. The restaurant weathered the 9.2 magnitude Good Friday earthquake of 1964, the second most powerful earthquake ever recorded on Earth, and kept serving. George worked the dining room as a familiar face until his death in 2018. The chicken is still buttermilk marinated, boiled, then breaded and pan-fried, a technique that produces famously tender gizzards and livers alongside the signature thin, crispy-skinned chicken pieces. And the recipe from 1955 is, by the family's own account, almost entirely unchanged on today's menu. In 2002, the Small Business Administration named the Lucky Wishbone Alaska's Small Business of the Year, and Peggy flew to Washington, D.C. to accept the award, where Senator Ted Stevens introduced her to President George W. Bush by saying, "This lady makes some of the best fried chicken in the country." In 2025, 70 years after George and Sven built the building by hand, the James Beard Foundation named the Lucky Wishbone a recipient of its America's Classics Award, recognizing it as one of the country's most beloved, enduring, independently owned restaurants. In 1996, two rock climbers named Rod Hancock and Matt Jones decided to open a pizzeria and brew pub in a midtown Anchorage location that had a local reputation for being cursed. Every previous business to occupy the spot had failed. They named it Moose's Tooth, after a jagged granite spire deep in the Alaska Range that's considered one of the most technically demanding big wall climbs in North America. Fitting, for two founders who'd traded their climbing ambitions for pizza dough and house-brewed beer. The location's curse, whatever it was, did not apply to them. Moose's Tooth became one of the busiest restaurants in Anchorage almost immediately, eventually expanding to roughly 300 seats and spinning off a sister restaurant, Beartooth Theater Pub, along with their own Broken Tooth Brewing Company, together now employing more than 500 people. The pizzas are hand-tossed and stone-baked from scratch, built on more than 2 decades of what the restaurant itself describes as creativity, experimentation, and love. And the specialty pies lean hard into Alaska's available ingredients: reindeer sausage, Alaska salmon, wild mushrooms, locally brewed beer reductions in the sauces. If Moose's Tooth has a single signature dish that defines the entire Anchorage pizza identity, it's this one. Reindeer sausage pizza takes the same domesticated reindeer meat found in the downtown hot dog carts and crumbles it across a stone-baked pie, typically alongside mozzarella, provolone, and a garlic cream or marinara base. The reindeer's slightly sweet, gamey richness playing against the cheese in a way that beef or pork sausage simply doesn't replicate. It shows up across virtually every Anchorage pizzeria menu in some form, but Moose's Tooth's version, sometimes paired with macaroni noodles and 3 cheeses in their mac and cheese reindeer pizza, has become the dish visitors specifically ask about online before they've even landed in Alaska. The reindeer sausage itself is sourced from Alaska's domesticated reindeer herds, primarily raised on the Seward Peninsula in the western part of the state. Descendants of the animals brought over from Siberia in the 1890s specifically to stabilize Alaska native food security. You will not find this in a restaurant case the way you'll find reindeer sausage or salmon. Moose hunting is heavily regulated, and most moose meat in Anchorage comes not from a grocery store but from a family's own legal harvest, or from a neighbor's freezer after a successful fall season. Moose stew is the home kitchen backbone of an Anchorage winter. Cubed moose meat, browned and simmered for hours with potatoes, carrots, onion, and whatever root vegetables survived the short Alaska growing season, in a broth built from the moose's own juices and stock. The meat is leaner and denser than beef, with a deep, slightly sweet, distinctly wild flavor that requires longer, slower cooking to tenderize properly. Exactly the kind of dish a household makes after a successful hunt, when a single animal can fill an entire chest freezer for the winter. Moose stew connects Anchorage to its rural Alaska identity, even as the city itself has grown into the state's only real metropolitan area. A reminder that, for a significant share of Anchorage households, a sizable portion of the winter's protein still comes directly from the surrounding wilderness rather than a supermarket case, processed and frozen by the family that shot it. This entry requires a specific kind of explanation because it's less about a single dish and more about a defining Anchorage condiment habit that visitors notice almost immediately. Ranch dressing shows up here with a frequency and enthusiasm that rivals anywhere else in the country. Pizza dipped in ranch. Fries dipped in ranch. Reindeer sausage dipped in ranch. Ranch as a base sauce option on pizza menus alongside marinara and garlic cream. Ranch served alongside fried chicken at diners like the Lucky Wishbone. Ranch as the default companion to nearly anything fried that comes out of an Anchorage kitchen. Alaska, and Anchorage specifically, is frequently cited in national surveys and food media as one of the heaviest ranch-consuming regions in the country. A fact locals tend to find amusing rather than surprising, because to them it's simply the correct way to eat most things. The exact reason Anchorage embraced ranch this thoroughly is hard to pin to a single date or person, the way a Lucky Wishbone or a Moose's Tooth can be traced to a founder and a year. Anchorage sits at the doorstep of some of the most productive wild salmon runs on the planet. Cook Inlet, the Kenai River, Bristol Bay, waters within reach by short flight. And the cedar plank preparation is the city's most iconic way of letting that fish speak for itself. A fillet of wild salmon, king, sockeye, or silver, depending on the season, is laid directly on a soaked cedar plank and set over open flame or in a hot oven. As the plank heats, it releases smoke and aromatic cedar oils directly into the fish from underneath, infusing it with a smoky, slightly sweet, distinctly woodsy flavor, while the wood also protects the delicate flesh from direct, scorching heat. The technique traces back to Pacific Northwest and coastal indigenous fish cooking traditions, adapted and embraced wholesale by Alaska's seafood restaurants as the default way to showcase a fish this good without overcomplicating it with sauce or seasoning. The Alaska roll takes the California roll format that swept American sushi culture in the late 20th century and replaces the imitation crab with the one ingredient Anchorage actually has in genuine, world-class abundance: smoked or fresh wild salmon. A typical Alaska roll wraps rice and nori around salmon, avocado, and cucumber, sometimes finished with a thin slice of smoked salmon draped over the top of the roll rather than rolled inside it. A visual signature that distinguishes it on a sushi menu at a glance. The roll exists because of a straightforward culinary logic. If California rolled its regional avocado culture into sushi and Philadelphia rolled its cream cheese bagel culture into sushi, Alaska was always going to roll its salmon into sushi, because salmon is the fish this state is actually built on. Anchorage sushi restaurants treat the Alaska roll as close to a baseline menu requirement. The dish a visitor orders specifically because the name promises a local specialty, and the kitchen delivers exactly that: the same wild salmon running through Cook Inlet, repackaged into a format that travels well across the rest of the sushi-eating world. This is the dessert with a name that sounds like the most obvious entry on this entire list, and the most surprising true origin story. Baked Alaska was not invented in Alaska. The dessert, ice cream encased in sponge cake, covered in meringue, and briefly torched or baked at extremely high heat so the meringue browns while the ice cream inside stays frozen, is most commonly credited to chefs at Delmonico's restaurant in New York City in 1876, created specifically to commemorate the United States' recent purchase of the Alaska Territory from Russia in 1867. The dish was meant as a kind of edible tribute to the nation's newest, coldest acquisition. A dessert that performs the trick of staying frozen even while its exterior is set ablaze, much as Alaska itself was imagined by the rest of the country as a place of impossible, frozen extremes. Anchorage restaurants serve baked Alaska today less as a historical curiosity and more as a tourist-facing signature dessert, a dish whose name makes it an automatic menu fixture in the one American city that can claim it by association, even though the actual kitchen that invented it was 3,500 miles away in Manhattan.